The morning sun moved slowly across the sky, sending a soft light through the thin curtains of the little wooden house. The room was quiet except for the steady tick of an old clock on the wall. A small cup of tea sat on the table, steam rising into the cool air. She sat there, still and thoughtful, her hands wrapped around the cup as if trying to hold on to its warmth. Her name was Amina. She was only 19, yet her eyes carried the weight of many years. People often said her eyes looked too tired for someone so young, but no one truly knew the storm she had survived. The silence in her home was deep, but inside her mind the noise of whispers and questions never stopped. Everyone in the town talked about her. They said cruel words. They asked, why did such a young, poor black girl marry a man of 70? Some laughed, some gossiped, and others judged her from a distance. But no one ever tried to ask her heart for the truth. Amina looked at the clock. Its slow ticking sounded louder than before. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Each second reminded her of the life she had chosen, a life no one around her understood. But before judgment, before gossip, there had been hunger, loneliness, and fear. And then, there had been him. The morning carried her back to memories of her past. She could almost hear the old streets of her childhood, the sounds of people selling fruits, the noise of neighbors talking, the cries of children playing. But for her, those days had not been full of laughter. They were days of empty plates, of stomachs that ached with hunger, and of nights where the cold air bit through thin blankets. Her mother had passed when she was very small. Her father left soon after, never returning. Amina grew up in the hands of relatives who cared more for themselves than for a lonely child. She worked wherever she could, washing clothes, sweeping floors, or carrying water. Sometimes she was paid with a single meal, sometimes with nothing at all. People in the town never saw the way she shivered at night, holding her knees close to her chest, whispering to herself that tomorrow would be better. They never saw the tears she wiped away quickly, afraid someone might see weakness in her. Now, as she sat in her small house, married to a man old enough to be her grandfather, she knew people thought she had sold herself for security. They did not know the full truth. They did not know the heart. Her husband, the 70-year-old man named Ibrahim, was still asleep in the next room. She could hear the faint sound of his slow breathing. It was steady, calm, like the breathing of someone who had made peace with life. She had once found that sound strange, but now it gave her comfort. In the silence of her mornings, his presence was the one thing that made her feel safe. She closed her eyes for a moment and thought about the first time she had met him. She could still remember the cafe where she had gone to work as a helper, cleaning tables and carrying dishes. She had been tired that day, her clothes worn, her stomach empty. And then she had seen him, an old man sitting by the window, his hands slow but gentle as he lifted his cup of tea. His eyes had looked at her not with judgment but with kindness. That was the beginning of everything. But now in this quiet morning, the world outside still judged. Amina lifted her cup of tea and took a slow sip. The taste was plain, just tea and water, but to her it felt rich because it was hers. The clock ticked again. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Her thoughts turned heavy again. She wondered how many people would ever believe the truth, that her marriage was not about money, not about fear, but about something far more complicated, something softer, something only her heart could explain. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of children running through the streets, their laughter ringing like bells. It reminded her of all she had missed in her own childhood. It reminded her of the emptiness she had carried, the loneliness that sometimes felt like it would never end. She put her cup down on the table and placed her hands on her lap. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her heart was calm. The silence in her house was deep, but in that silence was also a story, her story. Amina took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "They don't know me. They don't know why." The room seemed to grow even quieter, as if the walls themselves were listening. She knew that someday the truth would be told. Someday people would hear not just the gossip, but the reason why a poor girl with nothing in her hands and so much emptiness in her heart had chosen to marry a man who carried 70 years on his shoulders. For now, the morning moved slowly, the tea cooled, and the clock ticked on. And so began her tale, a tale of hunger, of judgment, of comfort, and of love that the world would never understand. The morning light slowly faded into memory as Amina's thoughts drifted back to the life she had lived before her marriage. It was not a life of comfort or warmth. It was a life where hunger was her only companion, and hard days followed one after another like endless waves crashing on the shore. Her childhood had been painted with shadows. After her mother's death, she became like a leaf blown by the wind, unwanted, fragile, and always searching for a place to rest. Her relatives took her in, but not out of love. To them, she was an extra mouth to feed, a burden in a house that already had little. They gave her a corner to sleep in, but never gave her the affection she longed for. Every day was work. She washed clothes by the river, her small hands raw and red from cold water. She swept floors in homes that smelled of food she could never taste. She carried heavy buckets of water, her thin arms trembling under the weight. When she asked for payment, they often told her she should be thankful she was even allowed to stand inside their homes. At night, she lay awake with her stomach growling, the ache so strong it made her cry quietly into her torn blanket. She used to imagine food, warm bread, hot soup, soft rice, and those dreams were the only meals she had. The sound of her own heartbeat was the only comfort in the silent nights. The children in her village never played with her. They pointed and whispered, calling her the hungry girl or the poor one. Their laughter cut through her heart like a knife. She would stand far away watching them play games, and she wished, just once, someone would hold out a hand and say, "Come join us." But no one ever did. Her hunger was not only for food. She was hungry for kindness, for love, for someone who would look at her and see her as more than a poor orphan girl. But the world gave her nothing. There were days she thought she would not survive, days when her legs were too weak to walk, when her head spun from emptiness. Yet still she pushed forward, carrying water, cleaning houses, doing whatever she could. She told herself that if she stopped, she would die, and she was too young to let life slip away. But poverty is not just about empty stomachs. It is about dignity stripped away, about people looking through you as if you are invisible. Amina knew that pain well. She had seen women in the market push her aside. She had felt the sting of words when someone muttered, "Don't come too close, you smell of work and sweat." Each insult pressed down on her like a stone. The worst part was the loneliness. When she returned to her small corner at night, there was no one waiting for her, no one to say, "You did well today," or "Don't worry, tomorrow will be better." She only had the cold wall beside her, the thin blanket above her, and the endless emptiness inside her. It was in those nights that her heart began to harden. She promised herself she would never beg for kindness again. If the world wanted her to be strong, she would be strong. But even with that promise, she was still just a young girl, and sometimes strength was not enough to fight the cold winds of life. Years of such pain shaped her into the woman she became. She learned to keep her face calm, even when her stomach twisted with hunger. She learned to lower her eyes when others looked at her with disdain. She learned to survive with very little, and she carried herself with quiet pride, even when she owned nothing at all. By the time she turned 19, she had become like stone on the outside, but inside, she was still the same girl who longed for warmth. That longing was hidden deep, but it was still alive, waiting for the smallest spark to bring it back to life. When she first saw Ibrahim, she had no reason to think he would be that spark. He was an old man, slow in his movements, his hair white like snow, but he looked at her differently. His eyes did not pass over her like she was invisible. He looked straight at her as if she mattered, and in that moment something inside her heart moved. It was small like the flicker of a candle in a dark room, but for a girl who had lived through hunger and hard days, that small flicker was enough to begin changing everything. She did not know then that their paths would join, that her life would soon be filled with choices that would shock the whole town. All she knew was that for the first time, someone's gaze felt like shelter. And after all her years of hunger and loneliness, shelter was the one thing she had been searching for. The clock in her small house ticked on, pulling her back from memory. She touched the wooden table in front of her, rough beneath her fingers, and whispered to herself, "Those days are gone, but they made me who I am." Outside, the world still judged her, but inside she carried the truth. Her hunger had led her here. Her hard days had prepared her, and her heart had chosen a path that only she could understand. The afternoon sun was soft that day, and the air smelled faintly of roasted coffee beans drifting from a small cafe near the corner of the busy street. The corner of the busy street. The cafe was not fancy, just a place where old men gathered to talk about politics or where tired workers sat with cups of tea before returning home. The sound of spoons tapping against cups mixed with quiet conversations and the shuffle of chairs on the tiled floor. Amina entered quietly, her steps unsure. She had been hired to help clean the tables and carry dishes for a few coins. It was not much, but for her, even a little money meant survival. Her clothes were plain, her hair tied back simply, and her eyes carried the same quiet sadness she had lived with for years. No one in the cafe looked twice at her. To them, she was just another poor girl trying to earn her bread. But at the table near the window sat a man who noticed. His name was Ibrahim. His hair was white, his hands slow, his face lined with the marks of 70 years. He was sipping tea, his fingers wrapped carefully around the warm cup. While others in the cafe spoke loudly, he remained silent, watching the world through the glass window as if searching for something far away. When Amina walked past his table to wipe it clean, his eyes lifted and met hers. She froze for a moment, not used to being looked at in such a way. His gaze was not sharp, not judging. It was steady, calm, almost kind. She quickly lowered her eyes and continued wiping, her heart beating a little faster. Ibrahim's voice was gentle when he finally spoke. "You must be tired," he said. Amina was surprised. No one had ever asked her that before. People usually gave her orders, told her to hurry, told her she was too slow. She nodded shyly and whispered, "It's work, sir." "It is okay." He smiled faintly, a small smile that seemed to carry both sadness and warmth. "Work should not steal all your strength," he replied, then went back to his tea. Amina walked away, but her mind stayed with his words. It felt strange to hear concern from someone she barely knew. For the rest of the afternoon, as she carried plates and cleaned tables, she found herself stealing quick glances at the old man by the window. When her shift ended, she stood outside the cafe, the evening breeze brushing her face. She expected nothing, only the same long walk back to her corner of a crowded house. But then, to her surprise, Ibrahim stepped out of the cafe too. "You forgot this," he said, holding out a small handkerchief. She had left it on the counter. His hand shook slightly as he gave it to her, the tremor of age clear, but his eyes stayed steady on hers. "Thank you," she said softly, taking it. He nodded and looked at her for a moment longer before asking, "Do you live nearby?" She hesitated. She had always been taught not to trust strangers. But there was something gentle in his presence, something that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt for many years. "Yes," she answered quietly. He smiled again, this time with a touch of sadness. "That is good. The world is too big for a young girl to walk alone." Those words stayed with her long after he walked away. The next day, when she returned to the cafe for work, she saw him again. He was sitting at the same table near the window, sipping tea slowly as if time moved differently for him. She tried to avoid his eyes, but when she placed his cup on the table, he thanked her with the same soft tone. Over the next few weeks, their paths crossed more and more. He was always there, sitting quietly, reading an old newspaper or simply watching the street. And she was always there, cleaning, serving, working. Their conversations were small at first, a greeting, a question, a kind remark. But each word felt like a thread slowly weaving something unseen between them. For Amina, those moments became a strange comfort. No one else in her life asked if she was tired. No one else said thank you with real meaning. And for Ibrahim, her quiet presence seemed to bring light to his lonely afternoons. One evening, as the cafe grew quiet, she sat down for a moment to rest. Ibrahim looked at her with a softness in his eyes. "You remind me of my daughter," he said. "She was full of dreams, but life can be hard, and dreams do not always survive." Amina lowered her head, not knowing what to say, but inside she felt a deep ache. She wanted to ask him about his life, about the sadness in his smile, but the words stayed trapped in her throat. Instead, she whispered, "Sometimes dreams come back, when someone gives you hope." Their eyes met again, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between them. It was not love, not yet, but it was understanding, an invisible bridge between a poor young girl and a lonely old man. From that day, their meetings no longer felt like chance. It was as if life itself had decided to bring their paths together, against all expectations, against all judgment. Amina did not know it yet, but that simple cafe, with its clinking cups and gentle hum of voices, would become the place where her fate began to change forever. The rain tapped softly against the cafe window that evening. each drop making a rhythm that filled the quiet space. The lamps glowed dimly, casting golden light across the room, and the scent of coffee lingered in the air. The cafe was nearly empty, and Amina sat at a table after finishing her work, her hands folded nervously in her lap. Ibrahim sat across from her. His movements were slow, his breathing heavy, but his eyes carried a calmness that eased her heart. For weeks now, they had spoken little by little, and somehow, without either of them noticing, their conversations had grown longer, their silences more comfortable. "You work too hard," he said, his voice low and steady, almost blending with the sound of rain. Amina smiled faintly, though her eyes carried the weariness of long days. "If I don't work, there is no food." He looked at her closely, then sighed. "Life should be more than hunger and tiredness." The words touched something deep in her chest. No one had ever said such things to her. People in her life only reminded her of how poor she was, how little she owned, how little she mattered. Yet this man, so old and so far from her world, spoke to her as if she was worth something. She lowered her head, whispering, "That is not life for me. That is survival." The silence stretched between them. The rain grew heavier, sliding down the glass like silver threads. Ibrahim's hands, marked by age, trembled slightly as he reached for his cup. Amina noticed and quickly leaned forward. "Let me help," she said, steadying the cup for him. Their fingers brushed, and she felt a warmth that startled her. It was a simple touch, yet it sent a quiet shiver through her heart. Ibrahim gave a small smile, one filled with gratitude. "Thank you. These hands do not always listen to me anymore." She looked at him, at the lines on his face, at the tiredness in his body, and felt something she had not expected. Not pity, not fear, but a strange kind of closeness. Over the next weeks, their meetings became more frequent. Sometimes they spoke about small things, about the weather, about the busy street outside, about the tea that was too bitter or too sweet. Other times they spoke about memories. "I was once a strong man," Ibrahim told her, his voice carrying both pride and sorrow. "I built houses, I carried stones, I worked from sunrise to sunset. Now I walk slowly and my breath runs short. Time takes from us what we do not want to give." Amina listened with wide eyes. She had never heard anyone speak about life with such honesty. She whispered, "And still you smile." He looked at her, his old eyes shining. "Because even in loss there can be meaning. Even in old age there can be beauty. Sometimes it is found in unexpected places." Her cheeks warmed. She did not know what to say, but in her heart she felt the truth of his words. One evening, when the cafe was empty, Ibrahim asked her a question that surprised her. "Do you dream, Amina?" She froze, her hand tightening around the edge of the table. Dreams had been a luxury she could not afford. Hunger and hard work left no room for dreams. But in that moment, looking into his gentle eyes, she felt safe enough to answer. "Yes," she whispered. "I dream of a home. A place where I do not feel like a burden. A place where someone is glad I exist." Ibrahim's face softened, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then with quiet strength he replied, "That is not too much to ask. Every heart deserves such a place." His words stayed with her. At night, when she lay on her thin blanket, she thought of his voice, of the way he looked at her, not with pity but with respect. It was strange, almost impossible, that a 70-year-old man could give her what no one else had. Dignity. The townspeople would never understand. They would say he was too old, that she was too young, that nothing good could come from such closeness. But when she was near him, the noise of the world faded. In his presence, the emptiness inside her was less sharp. It was not love yet, not the kind of love people whispered about in stories. But it was comfort, deep and quiet, like a soft blanket over a weary soul. It was a bond that made her heart feel less heavy. One night, as rain fell again, she walked beside him after he left the cafe. The streets were dark, the lamps flickering. His steps were slow, and she matched her pace with his. The world was wide and full of judgment, but in that small walk it was only the two of them. At the door of his modest house, he turned to her. His voice trembled, but his eyes were steady. "Thank you, Amina, for your company. You do not know how much it means to an old man like me." Her throat tightened. She wanted to say that his company meant just as much to her, but the words stuck inside. Instead, she simply nodded, her eyes shining in the dim light. As she walked home that night, her heart beat with a rhythm she had not felt in years. It was not the rhythm of hunger, not the rhythm of loneliness. Of hunger, not the rhythm of loneliness. It was something new, something fragile but alive. A strange comfort had entered her life, and though she did not yet understand where it would lead, she knew one thing: she was no longer walking through her days completely alone. The evening air was cool, and the faint sound of crickets filled the silence outside Ibrahim's small home. Amina sat inside, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes drifting across the simple room. The wooden walls were bare, the old clock ticked slowly, and a faint fire crackled in the corner. It was not a rich man's house, but it carried a warmth that reminded her of safety. She had been there before, helping him bring groceries, sharing tea, or simply sitting quietly while he told her stories of the past. But tonight felt different. The air was heavy, filled with an unspoken weight. Ibrahim moved slowly around the room, his cane tapping lightly on the floor. His shoulders bent with age, yet his eyes carried a light that had not dimmed. When he finally sat across from her, he sighed deeply, as though gathering the strength for words that had been waiting too long. "Amina," he began, his voice steady but low. "I am an old man. I have seen many seasons, and I have watched time take much from me. My strength, my speed, even some of my friends. But life has given me something too, meeting you." Amina lowered her gaze, her fingers trembling slightly. She had never been praised in such a way, never been told she was a gift to someone else's life. The warmth of his words wrapped around her, but fear also crept into her heart. What was he trying to say? Ibrahim leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. "I do not have riches. I do not have youth. But what I do have, I wish to share with you. I want you to stay with me. Not as a visitor, not as a helper, but as my wife." The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. The crackling fire seemed louder, the ticking clock sharper. Amina's breath caught in her throat. She stared at him, unable to speak. "Wife?" she whispered at last, her voice trembling. He nodded slowly, his face calm but his eyes full of honesty. "Yes, I know what the world will say. They will laugh, they will call it strange. But I do not care. I only know that in you I see kindness I thought I had lost. I see life, hope, and I wish to spend whatever years I have left beside you." Amina's heart pounded in her chest. She felt the weight of his words pressing against her soul. Marriage. It was something she had never dared to imagine. She had spent her life fighting hunger, loneliness, and the cold judgment of others. Could she truly accept such a path? Her thoughts spun quickly. She remembered the whispers of the townspeople, the sharp laughter of children, the cruel words of neighbors. If she married him, the gossip would only grow louder. People would say she did it for money, for shelter, for selfish reasons. But then she looked at him. His old hands rested on the table, shaking slightly yet steady in their offering. His eyes, though lined with years, held no trickery, no hidden game. Only sincerity. He spoke again gently. "You do not have to answer now. But I need you to know my heart. I want you not out of pity, not out of loneliness, but because I believe you deserve a home, respect, and a place where you are wanted." Tears burned in Amina's eyes. No one had ever said she deserved anything. For so long she had believed she was only a burden, only someone to be used and then ignored. His words broke something inside her, broke the wall she had built around her heart. "Ibrahim," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You are 70. I am 19. People will never accept it." He smiled faintly, sadness and strength blending in his expression. "Let them talk. Let them laugh. What matters is not their voices. What matters is what we choose, what we carry in our hearts. I cannot offer you the life of a young man, but I can offer you peace, respect, and a love that will never fade." The fire crackled louder, filling the silence that followed. Amina felt her hands shaking as she tried to breathe. She saw his frailty, but she also saw his courage. He was offering her not riches, not promises of power, but something far deeper: sincerity. For the first time in her life, someone was choosing her not for what she could give, not for what she could do, but for who she was. Her lips trembled as she finally found her voice. I need time." Ibrahim nodded gently, his eyes soft. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I only ask that you keep my words in your heart." They sat there in silence, the firelight casting long shadows across the room. Amina's mind was a storm, her heart torn between fear and longing. But deep inside, a seed had been planted, a seed of possibility of belonging. When she left his home that night, the cool air wrapped around her like a question. The streets were dark and the whispers of the world seemed to follow her. But beneath all the noise, one truth lingered in her heart. For the first time in her life, someone had asked her to stay, not out of duty, but out of love. And though she had not yet said yes, she knew the answer was already growing quietly inside her. The morning sun had barely risen when the whispers began. In the marketplace, where women sold vegetables and men bargained loudly over prices, the sound of gossip traveled faster than the smell of fresh bread. "Have you heard?" one woman muttered as she weighed a basket of tomatoes. "That poor black girl, the one who works at the cafe, she's going to marry the old man. 70 years old," another woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. 70! That's not a husband. That's a grandfather. What shame. The word spread like fire through dry grass. Shopkeepers leaned over their counters. Neighbors stopped in the streets and children giggled behind their hands. Every corner carried the same story. Amina, the poor girl with nothing, had chosen a man whose hair was white and whose body moved slower each day. By the time Amina stepped into the market to buy rice, she felt the eyes on her. Every stare cut into her skin. Every whisper seemed to chase her. She kept her head low, her hands clutching the small basket. But the voices around her were sharp. She's only 19. She's doing it for money. Maybe he gave her land. Maybe gold. Or maybe she's desperate. Each word struck her heart. But she walked on, her steps steady even as her chest tightened. When she returned home, she sat quietly on her bed, her thin blanket folded neatly beside her, the silence of her small room pressed against her ears. But it was kinder than the noise of the world outside. Still, their words lingered. The laughter, the disbelief, the cruel comments, they echoed in her mind like a storm that refused to end. Ibrahim noticed the change in her. That evening when she came to his home, her face was pale, her eyes heavy. He poured her a cup of tea and asked gently, "What troubles you, Amina?" She tried to hide it, but the truth spilled out. "They laugh at me. They say I am foolish, that I am only with you for what you have. They call me names and they look at me as if I am nothing." Ibrahim listened quietly, his old hands folded on the table. When she finished, his voice was calm, steady as a stone in a rushing river. "The world will always talk, Amina. They cannot see your heart, so they invent their own stories. But hearts are not for the world to understand. They are for you to carry, for you to protect." Tears slipped down her cheeks, silent and heavy. "But it hurts. I have lived with judgment all my life. Now it feels worse. Now they see me as something to laugh at." He reached across the table, his trembling hand resting gently on hers. The touch was warm, grounding. "Listen to me. I am 70 years old. I have lived through wars, through hunger, through loss. I have been called weak, useless, too old. Words are easy for people. They cost nothing. But words do not define us. Actions do." His voice grew softer but firmer. "They will laugh today, but tomorrow they will forget. What will stay is the life we choose to build. That is what matters." Amina looked at him, her tears still falling, but her heart finding a small space of calm. In his eyes she saw truth. In his presence she felt a strength she had never known. The town did not stop. The whispers grew louder as the days passed. Children pointed when she walked by. Old women shook their heads. Men smirked as if they knew secrets that were not theirs to tell. Every step outside became heavy, but every step toward Ibrahim's home became lighter. One evening, as she walked through the street, a group of women stopped her. "Amina," one of them said sharply, "why throw your youth away? You could marry someone your age. Why waste yourself on a man who may die soon?" Amina's lips trembled, but her voice was steady when she answered, "Because he sees me. Not as a poor girl, not as a burden. He sees me." The women fell silent, their mouths opening but no words coming. Amina walked past them, her heart still pounding but her soul carrying a strange new pride. Later that night she sat beside Ibrahim in his small living room. The old clock ticked, the fire flickered, and the world outside seemed far away. "They don't understand us," she whispered. He smiled gently, his hand covering hers again. "They don't need to. We understand, and that is enough." In that quiet moment, Amina realized something. For the first time in her life, she was not hiding in shame, not shrinking under judgment. She was standing in her truth even if the world did not believe in it. The whispers of the town had not stopped, but inside Ibrahim's home, they faded into nothing. Here she found a silence that was not empty but full of acceptance, of warmth, of a bond that no gossip could break. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Amina knew this. The world could laugh, but her heart had finally found a place where it was no longer hungry. The nights grew colder as the season shifted. The wind carried the scent of rain and the streets emptied earlier each evening. But in Ibrahim's small home, the fire in the hearth glowed warm and the silence between him and Amina no longer felt empty. It felt alive. They often sat together without speaking much. She would place tea on the table, her hands brushing against his, and the quiet hum of the clock filled the space. Sometimes she told him about her days, the cruel words she heard in the market, the weight of judgment pressing on her shoulders. He always listened, never interrupting, his eyes soft with patience. And sometimes he spoke. About the past, about the house he had built with his own hands, about the friends who were gone, about the long years of loneliness that had sat beside him until she appeared. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Amina sat with her knees drawn up on the old wooden chair. The fire crackled softly, filling the room with its glow. Ibrahim leaned back, his breathing slow, his cane resting beside him. "You are quiet tonight," he said, his voice low, almost blending with the rain. She hesitated, then whispered, "I was thinking, how strange life is. I never imagined I would find peace with someone like you." He gave a small smile. "Strange, yes, but sometimes the strange paths are the ones that lead us home." Her heart tightened at his words. She looked at him, at the lines of his face, at the tiredness in his body, at the steady warmth in his eyes. And she realized that what she felt for him was not pity, not duty, but something deeper, something softer. When she reached across the table and placed her hand over his, the silence in the room grew louder, charged with meaning. His old hand trembled beneath hers, but he did not pull away. Instead, his fingers curled gently, holding hers with surprising strength. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The rain grew heavier, the fire dimmed, and the world outside disappeared. In that quiet, their bond was clear, not spoken, not explained, but felt. Later that night, when she stood to leave, Ibrahim's voice stopped her. "Amina," he said softly, "you bring light to a life that was fading. I thought my days of meaning were over. But you remind me that even at the end of a journey, love can still arrive." Her chest ached, tears rising in her eyes. She wanted to tell him she felt the same, that his presence was the first place she had ever felt safe, ever felt wanted. But her voice failed her. Instead, she gave a small nod, her eyes shining, and whispered, "You know what happened next." The line hung in the air, unfinished but heavy with truth. They both smiled faintly, as if sharing a secret too tender to be spoken aloud. From that evening on, something changed between them. Their silences grew sweeter, their laughter more frequent. She began to notice the little things, the way he looked at her when she poured tea, the way his voice softened when he said her name, the way his hand always reached for hers when they walked together, slow and steady, down the quiet street. The world outside still whispered cruel words, but inside Ibrahim's home a different truth lived. It was not the kind of love people wrote in poems, not fiery or loud, but a quiet, steady flame that warmed two lonely souls. Amina often thought about it at night, lying on her thin blanket. She would close her eyes and remember the way his hand felt in hers, the way his voice carried sincerity, the way his presence silenced the ache of her past. And each time her heart whispered the same answer. This was not about age, not about money, not about survival. This was about love, hidden but real. One night as they walked together, she said softly, "Do you ever regret asking me to stay?" He looked at her with surprise, then shook his head. "No, I regret only that I did not meet you sooner. Perhaps then I could have given you more years of joy." Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to say that joy did not care about years, that even a single day with him was more precious than a lifetime of loneliness. But instead she squeezed his hand, letting her silence speak the words she could not. In that moment she understood. Their love was not for the world to approve. It was not for neighbors to accept. not for strangers to understand. It belonged only to them, hidden in the quiet of his home, written in the unspoken lines between their words, carried in the gentle rhythm of their joined hands. The world saw a poor girl and an old man. But in truth, what lived between them was something no gossip could touch. A hidden love, tender and strong, that had bloomed against all odds. And though they never shouted it to the world, they knew it. And that was enough. The morning sun spilled through the thin curtains, painting soft gold across the small wooden room. The fire in the hearth had died during the night, and the silence was broken only by the steady tick of the old clock on the wall. Amina sat at the table with a cup of tea, her hands wrapped tightly around it. Her eyes were distant, her thoughts heavy but clear. The world outside still gossiped. The whispers had not faded. People still shook their heads, still asked the same question over and over. Why did she marry him? But inside this small house, the question no longer felt like a wound. Because Amina finally knew her answer. She thought back to the day Ibrahim had asked her to stay, not as a visitor, not as a helper, but as his wife. At first she had been afraid of laughter, of judgment, of the gap of years that stretched like a canyon between them, afraid of what others would say, of what they would take from her dignity. But when she looked at him, his trembling hands, his steady eyes, his honesty shining brighter than the firelight, she had felt something she could not explain. It was not pity. It was not desperation. It was not money or shelter or escape. It was the first time in her life that someone had looked at her and seen her as enough. Amina had spent 19 years in hunger, in loneliness, in silence. She had carried the weight of being unwanted, of being invisible. But Ibrahim's gaze had broken that darkness. He had not seen her as a burden. He had not seen her as a poor girl to be pitied. He had seen her as a woman deserving of respect, of care, of love. And so, when the time came, she said yes. The memory played in her mind as clearly as if it had happened only yesterday. She had walked into his small home, her heart racing, her palms damp with fear. He was sitting in his chair, his cane beside him, his eyes lifting the moment she entered. Ibrahim, she had whispered, her voice trembling, if you are still willing. My answer is yes. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of his sharp breath. Then his face had softened, his old eyes filling with tears. Thank you, he had said, his voice breaking. You have given me life again. That moment had sealed her path. The world outside could laugh, but in that room, the truth had been written. She had chosen not with her fear, but with her heart. Now as she sat in the morning light, she let her mind wander over all that had followed. There had been hard days, yes, days when cruel words chased her in the market, when children pointed and laughed, when neighbors refused to meet her eyes. But there had also been quiet nights by the fire, soft laughter shared over tea, long silences filled with meaning. There had been the comfort of a hand reaching for hers, the warmth of being wanted, the dignity of being loved without condition. That was why she had married him. Not for gold, for there was none. Not for power, for he had none. Not for escape, because marriage to a 70-year-old man was no escape at all. It was a battle against the whole world. She had married him because he gave her the one thing her soul had starved for. A home. And home, she now understood, was not a roof or walls or riches. It was a place where you were seen, where your existence mattered, where your heart was safe. For Amina, that place was not a house, but the space beside Ibrahim's trembling hand. Her tea had grown cold, but she did not move. She could hear his slow breathing from the other room. His health was fragile, his steps unsteady, and she knew their time together might be short. But she also knew that no matter how long or how brief, it was real. She whispered to herself, her voice steady now. They will never understand. But I do. The clock ticked on. The room quiet but alive with meaning. Outside, the town continued its gossip. But inside, the truth lived. Quiet, steady, unshaken. Amina lifted her head, her eyes clear. Her marriage was not a bargain, not a trap, not a mistake. It was a choice born not from hunger, but from the deepest need of the human heart. She had said yes because he had given her what no one else ever had, love without question, respect without doubt, and a home without fear. And for her, that was enough. The sound of footsteps reached her ears as Ibrahim entered the room slowly, his cane tapping against the floor. His face lit up when he saw her and he smiled, soft, tired, but full of warmth. Amina smiled back, her heart steady. She rose to pour him tea, the small clink of cups echoing in the room. The door closed softly against the noise of the world outside. And in that quiet where love lived unseen, her story found its answer.